Welcome to the Empty Cup. I'm Tsering Padron, and this podcast is a small pause in the middle of our busy lives. A moment to look more closely at our mind, at our reactions, our fears, our hopes, and also the possibility of meeting life with more clarity and kindness. And these reflections are not about having the right answers. There is no right or wrong here. They're just invitations to slow down, to question the things we assume, and perhaps be more open to the simplicity of the moment. So wherever you are, just take a breath, hold your empty cup, and let us pour some tea for thought. Today, I would like to speak about devotion, because as Westerners, we sometimes struggle with this. It is a word that makes many people uncomfortable. For some, devotion suggests blind faith, obedience, dependency, or even the surrender of critical thinking. For others, it evokes emotional intensity, admiration, idealization, and sometimes, unfortunately, disappointment. And perhaps this discomfort is understandable. We live in a culture that values independence. We have witnessed too many examples of authority being abused, and we have learned, rightly, to be cautious. And yet, devotion occupies a central place in many spiritual traditions, and certainly in Tibetan Buddhism. And why? What is it that these traditions are pointing towards? I once heard Mindraling Khandro Rinpoche define devotion as gratitude for wisdom. And that simple definition changed something for me. Because suddenly devotion was no longer about a person. It was no longer about hierarchy. It was no longer about obedience or fascination. It became something much more intimate and much more universal. Gratitude for wisdom. And not just wisdom in the ordinary sense of intelligence, knowledge, or knowing the right thing to say, though that also may be the case. But especially wisdom in the deepest sense, the wisdom that sees through our endless stories, the wisdom that recognizes the fleeting nature of everything we cling to, the wisdom that is spacious enough to embrace joy and sorrow alike, the wisdom that is inseparable from love. Sometimes through a teacher, we catch a glimpse of that. Not necessarily because the teacher is perfect, not because they never make mistakes, but because something shines through them, something we recognize even if we cannot explain it. And for a brief moment, we see a different possibility of being human. A simplicity, a freedom, a sanity, and the heart responds. Not with submission, with gratitude. Perhaps this is the beginning of devotion, not believing in someone, recognizing something. In Tibetan Buddhism, we say something like, if you see your guru as a Buddha, you receive the blessings of a Buddha. If you see him or her as a bodhisattva, you receive the blessings of a bodhisattva. But if you see him or her as an ordinary person, you will receive the blessings of an ordinary person. And this teaching is often misunderstood. It does not mean you should pretend that the teacher is perfect. It does not mean abandoning discernment. It does not mean excusing harmful behavior. Rather, it points to the quality of our own perception. So what does it mean to see the Guru as the Buddha? I think it means learning to recognize and relate to the awakened qualities that shine through them, to focus less on their personality and more on the wisdom, compassion, and freedom they reveal. In this sense, seeing the Guru as the Buddha is not a cult of personality, and it's not also not a statement about the teacher. It is a practice of perception, a way of looking beyond our ordinary habits of judgment, comparison, projection, and fixation. The blessing does not come from idealizing the person. It comes from becoming receptive to the possibility of awakening they embody and awaken in us. The mistake we often make is to confuse the doorway with what lies beyond it. We become attached to the form, to the personality, to our ideas about the teacher. We project perfection onto another human being and then feel betrayed when they sometimes reveal their humanity. But perhaps devotion was never meant to be directed towards a perceived perfection. Perhaps it is directed towards recognition, towards those moments where wisdom becomes visible. One of the difficulties with devotion is that teachers are human beings too. At different degrees of realization, of course. Some may be nearly perfect, but others aren't. Human beings are imperfect. They have personalities, preferences, blind spots, limitations. Sometimes they disappoint us. Sometimes they fail to live up to the image we have created of them. And we have to also acknowledge that sometimes we also see them through the stained lenses of our patterns and wounds and opinions and so on. It is true that sometimes they do fail in more serious ways. Sometimes teachers act unethically. Sometimes they misuse trust, authority, or power. And when this happens, acknowledging it is not a failure of devotion. It is an expression of wisdom. If something is harmful, it should be recognized as such. If we no longer feel aligned, we may need to create distance. We may even leave entirely. But leaving does not necessarily require bitterness, nor becoming distrustful about the teachings themselves. The tradition offers a safeguard. Alongside teachings on devotion, Buddhism also reminds us, rely on the Dharma, not on the person. Rely on the meaning, not on the words. Or in other words, devotion was never meant to replace discernment. The purpose of the teacher is not to become the center of our world, but to help us recognize the wisdom towards which they are pointing. We can remain grateful for what was generally received without pretending that everything was perfect. We can recognize the humanity of the teacher without denying the wisdom that shone through them. After all, let's be real. If wisdom could only appear through perfect people, we would all be in big trouble. Because wisdom is our nature, perhaps it can also appear through imperfect human beings, through teachers, through friends, through strangers, and, of course, through ourselves. Learning to recognize it amidst imperfection may itself be part of the path. As devotion matures, it becomes less emotional and more stable. It is no longer excitement, no longer fascination, no longer dependency. It becomes trust, a quiet confidence, a willingness to remain open. The heart is no longer clinging to the person. It just bows to the wisdom. And eventually, even that distinction begins to soften. Because what we recognized in the teacher begins to appear everywhere. In a conversation, in a spiritual friend, in the laughter of a child, in the beauty of a landscape, in the difficulties of life themselves, and especially in our own heart. The teacher, of course, remains precious, perhaps even more precious. But they become transparent, a window rather than an object of fixation, a reminder rather than a possession. The outer guru teaches us how to discover the inner guru. And then the world, the whole world, becomes our teacher. When that happens, then devotion becomes something very beautiful. Not something directed towards a particular individual, but a way of living. A continual gratitude for the wisdom that reveals itself through the countless forms of life. Sometimes quietly, sometimes unexpectedly, but always inviting us to wake up. Devotion is certainly not about becoming smaller in front of another. Perhaps it's more about becoming humble enough to recognize something infinitely greater than our own personal concerns, than our own personal story. Something vast, something loving, something that cannot be reduced or possessed. And when we recognize it, even briefly, the heart opens naturally. Not because it has been told to, not because it should, but because gratitude is the most natural response to wisdom. And this is it. I really wanted to share this because it is important. And of course, this is not, by all means, an absolute truth. It's just more like a reflection, something we can reflect upon with our cup empty of assumptions, perhaps. So, this is it. So, until the next time, let's keep our cup empty and our heart open.